Die Hauptstadt des Gaues Schlesien bildet einen der Eckpfeiler gegen den bolschewistischen Ansturm. Breslaus Bevölkerung ist von ihrem Gauleiter aufgerufen worden, die Stadt bis zum Äußersten zu verteidigen.
There are cities that die in hours. There are others that take months to do so, and that slow process, that agony extended in time, results infinitely more brutal. Breslau, January 1945. A metropolis of more than 600,000 inhabitants in the heart of Lower Silesia. A city with a Gothic cathedral, with a main square considered the second largest in Central Europe, with trams, with theatres, with universities, with a zoo. A city that at the end of 1944 was still, among all the large cities of the Reich, one of the few that the fire of war had not yet touched. The windows remained whole. The markets functioned. The children attended school. In 92 days, all of that disappeared. What you're going to hear is not just the story of a military siege. It is the story of a city turned into a fortress by order of a man who never lived in it, defended by soldiers who knew no one would come to rescue them, inhabited by civilians whom no one evacuated in time, and destroyed with a meticulousness that war rarely matches. It is the story of the Festung Breslau, the last fortress of the Reich, and of the 82 days it took to surrender. 2 days before the Second World War ended in Europe. To understand what occurred in Breslau in 1945, one must first understand what Breslau was before. The city had been settled on the banks of the Oder since the 10th century. It was a node of commercial routes between the Germanic West and the Slavic East, between the Baltic and the land-based Mediterranean. Its cathedral, built on the Cathedral Island, dated from the 13th century. Its city hall, the Rathaus, was one of the Gothic jewels of Central Europe, with an eastern facade that its inhabitants considered insuperable and that centuries of travellers had confirmed. The market square, Der Ring, with its coloured houses and its arcades, was indeed the second largest in the Germanic world after that of Krakow, with more than 200 metres in length. The bridges over the arms of the Oder connected it in all directions. In 1933, when the Nazis came to power, Breslau had around 600,000 inhabitants and was the fourth or fifth largest city in the Reich. It had its own airport, a tram network, several university hospitals, a significant industrial tradition in the manufacture of machinery and railway material. The Linke Hoffmann factory produced locomotives and wagons that circulated throughout Central Europe. It was a city with its own weight. What the war had brought until that moment was, above all, refugees. From 1943, and especially in 1944, the Allied bombings on German cities in the West Cologne, Hamburg, Dresden had launched tens of thousands of people toward the east, toward areas still intact. Breslau became the destination for many of them. By the end of 1944, the population had grown to reach nearly 1 million. Berlin children, families from the Rhineland, mothers with children who had lost their homes in the August bombings, all arrived seeking the safest place in the Reich. They found it just in time to get trapped in the worst of them all. On the 24th of August, 1944, Adolf Hitler signed the decree that declared Breslau a Festung fortress with the order to defend it at all costs. It was a designation applied that same year to dozens of cities in the German East: Königsberg, Poznan, Memel, Kustrin. The concept was simple in its statement and catastrophic in its consequences. Each city declared a fortress had to hold back the enemy, fix their forces, gain time for a counter-offensive that the German High Command kept promising. But that would never arrive. In practice, each Festung was a death sentence for those who remained inside. But in August 1944, the Eastern Front was still in Poland, and Breslau, more than 350 kilometers from the combat lines, remained for the majority of its inhabitants a relatively safe place. The Soviet bombings of November 1941, which had killed approximately half a dozen people in an operation that, given the distance from the front, was considered technically impressive, were the only trace of the war on the city. Half a dozen dead in 3 years. People did the shopping, the trams circulated, the restaurants in the center served dinners on Sundays, and the Luftwaffe also broadcast victory reports on the radio every night. At dawn on the 12th of January 1945, 4,000 Soviet cannons opened fire simultaneously along nearly 500 kilometers of front. The earth shook. The sky to the east of Poland lit up with a continuous light that observers described as an artificial dawn, a dawn that brought not day but destruction. In Breslau, more than 350 kilometers from the point of initial rupture, there was still no alarm. There was still normal life. The Vistula-Oder offensive was designed by Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Ivan Konev to break the German defenses in Poland and project the Red Army directly toward the heart of the Reich. It was not a trial offensive. It was the final attack, the one that would lead to Berlin. The Soviet generals calculated reaching the Oder River in 45 days. They achieved it in 11. General Heinz Guderian, chief of the General Staff of the German Army in those days, had warned Hitler repeatedly in the autumn of 1944 that the Eastern Front was a house of cards. He used exactly those words. Hitler responded as he was accustomed. The fortress would hold, the reserves would arrive, the situation would stabilize. On the 12th of January, it was demonstrated who was right. The front did not stabilize. The front collapsed. The first to advance were the armies of the First Ukrainian Front under the command of Konev. The next day, those of the Third Belarusian Front joined, and on the 14th of January, those of the First and Second Belarusian Fronts. It was the largest sustained offensive deployment in military history of the 20th century up to that point. The German Army Group A, under the command of Colonel General Joseph Harp, replaced on the 17th of January by Ferdinand Schörner, attempted to resist. The numbers did not add up. The lines fragmented in hours. On the 17th of January, Warsaw fell. 5 years and 4 months of German occupation ended in one day. The following day, Łódź and Krakow were taken almost without combat. Częstochowa fell on the 16th, Katowice on the 27th. The Soviet armored columns advanced at a rate of 30-40 kilometers daily, rolling over roads that in normal conditions would have taken weeks to cover. The German rearguard screens that attempted to slow them lasted hours, at most a day. The war correspondent Vasily Molinin, who followed the advance of the First Ukrainian Front, noted in his diary that the Soviet soldiers could barely believe the speed at which they were moving. "We passed through cities that yesterday were German and today are no longer so," he wrote. "No one seems to know where the war ends." And Breslau continued without evacuating its civilians. The first military commander of the fortress, Artillery General Johannes Krause, had alerted Hanke in the autumn of 1944. Breslau had no real defenses. If the front collapsed, the city would need to be evacuated immediately. At least 200,000 people had to be taken out before the Soviets cut the roads. Krause was ignored. Later, he was relieved. In his place arrived Major General Hans von Alphen on the 2nd of February 1945, designated personally by Schörner, commander of Army Group Center. Von Alphen was an engineer officer, methodical and without special brilliance. Schörner wanted a command that would act with energy but would not challenge Hanke's political authority. Von Alphen fit that profile for exactly 3 weeks. Meanwhile, the front continued approaching. On the 23rd of January, the Soviets took Gross-Wartenberg, a little over 60 kilometers from Breslau. On the 25th, Oels fell, less than 40. The road toward the city remained practically open. In the city, Red Cross volunteer Lena Aschner, who worked at the Central Railway Station managing the flow of refugees arriving from the east since the 17th of January, summarized what she saw in a note that historians have cited repeatedly. "Breslau is not a fortress. It is lost. Everyone knows it. Everyone knew it. And Gauleiter Karl Hanke still did not order the general evacuation. To understand Festung Breslau, one must understand Karl Hanke, because without him it does not exist. Karl August Hanke was born on the 24th of August, 1903 in Lubań, today Lubań, in Poland, son of a locomotive machinist. He grew up in the working-class neighborhoods of a small industrial city. He became a schoolteacher. They fired him in 1931 for his activities in the Nazi Party, which he had joined on the 1st of November 1928, with membership number 102,606. He was a convicted ideologue since his youth, with the nervous energy of one who knows that his only lever for social ascent is absolute loyalty to the cause. That loyalty took him to Berlin, and in Berlin it took him to Joseph Goebbels. Hanke became the personal secretary to the Minister of Propaganda of the Reich. He was a trusted man, an effective executor who did not question orders. Goebbels opened the doors for him. He introduced him to Hitler. He gave him prominence in party events. Hanke was elected a deputy of the Reichstag in 1932 and climbed within the ministry with the speed that only demonstrated loyalty and the absence of scruples to apply what he was commanded allow. But in the apparatus of the Reich, politics and personal scandal traveled together. In 1938, the marital relationship between Joseph Goebbels and Magda Goebbels entered a severe crisis. Goebbels had initiated a sentimental relationship with the Czech actress Lida Barova, an affair that Hitler had to order interrupted personally to avoid public scandal. In that context of domestic tension, Magda Goebbels, who wanted a divorce, found in Hanke someone willing to help her. Hanke compiled a dossier with documentation of 36 women involved in Goebbels' extramarital conduct, presented it to Hitler, and at the same time he himself initiated a relationship with Magda. The crisis reached such a point that Magda formally considered divorce. Hitler vetoed the separation, demanded that everything be resolved in silence and in private, and relegated Hanke to the background. The consequence was the transfer. In 1941, Hanke was designated Gauleiter of Lower Silesia and Oberpresident of the Prussian province of Lower Silesia, with headquarters in Breslau. It was an important but peripheral destination regarding the centers of power in Berlin. It could have been interpreted as a golden exile. Hanke interpreted it as an opportunity. In Breslau, he developed the profile of the absolutist governor. He had little patience for nuances. In the 4 years that he governed the region before the siege, he supervised the elimination of the Jews from the city, ordered the death of at least 1,000 political prisoners according to the records that survived, and built a reputation that in the documents of the era appears repeatedly described with the same phrase, a carbon copy of Hitler but without the charisma. Whoever worked near him described him as someone who spoke poorly in public, who lacked the rhetorical magnetism of party leaders with real influence, but who compensated for that deficiency with a will of steel to impose his decisions without hesitation. In January 1945, Goebbels began to mention him in his diaries with admiration. On the 3rd of April 1945, while Berlin was preparing for its own end, Goebbels noted that Hanke had received extraordinary praise from the leadership for his conduct in Breslau. The man whom Goebbels had exiled to Silesia for having slept with his wife had become, in the final moments of the Reich, one of its propaganda heroes. The paradox was so perfect that it was obscene. He also had a more structured private life than his public image suggested. In Breslau, he maintained for years a relationship with Baroness Freda von Firks, daughter of a wealthy landowner and professor at the University of Berlin. They had a daughter in December 1943. They married on the 25th of November 1944, exactly 2 months before the Soviet front collapsed and Hanke's world began to reduce to the limits of a besieged city. On the 19th of January 1945, Hanke finally issued the order. Women and children had to leave the city on foot in the direction of Opperau and Kanth, without organized transport, without field kitchens, without systematic provisions. The outside temperature that night was between 15 and 20 degrees below zero. It was a catastrophe. More than 700,000 people attempted to leave Breslau in the following days, the vast majority on foot. Those who had horse-drawn carts loaded them with what they could: furniture, clothes, photographs, the things that people consider essential when they have time to choose, and as they advanced along the frozen roads of Silesia, they left behind those objects one by one because the weight was unsustainable and the cold exhausted them sooner than expected. The carts were emptied. The people continued. Some could not continue. The thermoses with hot milk for the babies cooled after a few kilometers. The blankets became soaked with the falling snow and added weight to the exhaustion. The mothers who had calculated the distance in reasonable terms, 15 kilometers to the next town with shelter, discovered that 15 kilometers at 20 below zero, pulling a cart, carrying a child in arms, with another clinging to the skirt, do not have the same meaning as on a map hanging on the wall of an office. It is estimated that around 100,000 people died during that evacuation. The exact figure is impossible to verify. The bodies remained scattered on roads and ditches, frozen, and some were not found until the spring, when the thaw returned them to the surface with a level of deterioration that the cleaning teams described in their reports with a coldness that did not hide the horror. There was a specific stretch, the one leading toward Kanth, about 15 kilometers southwest of Breslau, that remained marked in a special way in the surviving testimonies. That stretch later received a name, the Death March of the Mothers of Breslau. Some 60,000 people attempted to travel it in the days of greatest cold. According to the records of the cleaning teams sent later, approximately 18,000 people died in that stretch. 18,000 bodies in 15 kilometers of road, more than 1,000 per kilometer. There is a testimony of a young assistant from the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the female organization of the Hitler Youth, who was traveling with an elderly truck driver on that same road at night. The vehicle's headlights illuminated what appeared to be an obstacle on the roadway. The driver asked her to get down to remove it. She thought they were dolls. When she reached them, she understood they were babies. Small children, abandoned in the middle of the road by parents who could no longer carry them and who had taken the decision in the midst of the cold, exhaustion and despair to continue alone and hope that someone would pick up their children. That woman survived the war. She had children of her own. And for decades she could not have dolls in her house. The mothers who sought milk for their babies in the towns along the way sometimes found cows abandoned in empty farms. Other times they found empty farms and nothing else. The late rescue teams sent by the Nazi administration arrived when it was already too late for the majority of those who had fallen. The corridor between Breslau and Kanth was described later by several of the survivors as a path lined with personal possessions. First heavy objects, then extra clothes, then photographs and documents, then the final things, until only what the person was wearing when they died remained. Inside the city, while all this was occurring, Hanke ordered the construction of barricades. The transformation of Breslau into what the party called an unassailable fortress was a chaotic, forced and brutally destructive process for its own inhabitants, long before the first Soviet soldier arrived. The orders were precise in their brutality. Every street had to become an obstacle, every building a point of resistance, every available resource a defense material. The work teams, formed by civilians under coercion, men recruited in the streets, in their homes, in the shelters, tore up cobblestones and piled them into barricades. The trams were overturned and welded in their position to block main avenues. The tombstones from the cemeteries, the trunks of the trees from the parks, the metallic window frames torn from entire facades, everything served. In some squares, anti-tank ditches up to 6 meters wide and 4 deep were excavated, reinforced with concrete and barbed wire. The bridges over the canals and the Oder were mined with charges prepared to be detonated by control. The ground floors of the larger buildings were walled up and turned into blockhouses with embrasures for machine guns oriented toward the main streets. In the autumn of 1944, months before the closing of the siege, more than 100,000 people had already been mobilized to dig anti-tank ditches in the surroundings of the city. The main ditch was 6 meters wide and 4 deep and extended for kilometers. The German officers who supervised the work, according to several testimonies collected later, were skeptical. One of them commented that the Soviets would take 30 minutes to cross it, 30 minutes to laugh at the defenses and 2 to traverse them. When winter arrived, the ditch filled with snow and the Soviet armored columns simply rolled over it. The Volkssturm, created by Hitler's decree on the 25th of September, 1944, was organized into 38 battalions within the city. Each battalion had, in theory, up to 600 men, although in practice the figures varied. Its members were men between 16 and 60 years old, veterans of the First World War with arthritis in their knees, alongside adolescents who had never fired a weapon. The armament was a sampling of what remained in the Reich's depots. Rifles captured in France in 1940, Italian rifles, Polish rifles, some Yugoslavian, shared at times between two men. The most abundant weapon was the Panzerfaust, the single-shot anti-tank grenade launcher, manufactured in 53 minutes and at a cost of 8 Reichsmarks per unit. Producing it was fast. Using it correctly, however, required practice that the majority did not have. To this were added, in January 1945, 50 Goliath vehicles, the small remote-controlled tanks filled with explosive and 18 flak 36 88mm anti-aircraft cannons that could also be used in an anti-tank role. The regular garrison was an equally heterogeneous mosaic, soldiers in retreat from other units who were detained at city checkpoints and reintegrated into combat. Units of the 609th Infantry Division, formed hastily and organized into regiments that bore the surnames of their commanders: Regiment Mohr, Regiment Sauer, Regiment Hanf, Regiment Vale of the Luftwaffe, Regiment SS Besslein, which included volunteers from France and the Netherlands, a detail that speaks for itself regarding the state of the SS in that phase of the war. Luftwaffe ground personnel, signal units, engineers, supply, police. At the end of January, a regiment of the Hitler Youth also arrived. In total, around 50,000 men were encircled inside the fortress. The garrison had 32 artillery batteries, equipped with a mixture of old German pieces and material captured from Soviets, Poles, Yugoslavs and Italians. Without tanks, properly speaking, except for a small company of 15 assault guns of different models. Facing them, Vladimir Gluzdovsky's Soviet Sixth Army deployed 1,000 artillery pieces around the perimeter. 1,000 pieces against 32 batteries. Discipline within the fortress was imposed with methods that went beyond the military. Hanke had established a regime of terror from the first days. Cowardice, defeatism, the slightest public expression of doubt was susceptible to taking a man before a summary court-martial. The usual penalty was death. The bodies of the executed were hung on poles and lampposts, with signs describing their fault. He died as a coward. He betrayed his city. The case of Wolfgang Spielhagen was the most emblematic. Spielhagen was the deputy mayor of Breslau, more a career official than a convicted politician. He had travelled to Berlin when he no longer had specific administrative functions in a besieged city. There was no financial department in a Festung, no budgets to manage, no contracts to sign. He simply presented himself before the party leadership in the capital, said he was available for any task, and no one assigned him anything. He returned to Breslau. Hanke had him arrested for desertion. He had him chained to a truck. He dragged him through the main streets of the historical centre in front of civilians and soldiers. Then they shot him in public. Hanke called that an infamous death for one who fears honourable death. It was a visible warning for all. It was also, in its specific form, the truest portrait of the man who governed the fortress. But not all civilians had been able to leave. Despite the evacuation orders, nearly 230,000 people remained inside the perimeter when the encirclement closed. Elderly people who could not walk, mothers with small children who waited too long, men detained at checkpoints and forced to stay, Polish forced labourers, some 3,000 who lived in conditions incomparably worse than the rest, and the priests. The clergy of Breslau, in their vast majority, did not abandon their parishes. They stayed with their parishioners. Over time, that decision would turn them into the most lucid chroniclers and the only real moral voice that remained inside the fortress. The Breslau Zoo was inside the perimeter. Around the 10th of February, when the encirclement was being completed, the zoo management received the order to sacrifice all animals. The reason was tactical. If the buildings were hit during combat and the cages opened, the besieged city could find itself simultaneously facing lions, tigers, wolves, and primates loose among the rubble. The same order would be given weeks later in the Berlin Zoo for the same reasons. The zoo director, or whoever assumed that responsibility, left a record of the process of animal sacrifice that subsequent translators described as one of the most difficult documents of the siege to read, not because of its length, but because of its tone. A list of animal deaths, one after another, narrated with the contained compulsion of someone who does something they know they will always remember. On the 8th of February 1945, Ivan Konev ordered the start of the Lower Silesian offensive. The immediate objective was to encircle Breslau. The final objective was to free the First Ukrainian Front to continue the advance toward Berlin. The plan was a pincer. From the north, the units of the Soviet 52nd Army had already established bridgeheads over the Oder at multiple points. From the south, the 5th Guards Army was pressing from Grotkow. In the center, the Soviet 6th Army, under the command of General Vladimir Gluzdovsky, 41 years old, Georgian by origin, 25 years in the Red Army, 6 rifle divisions under his command, had the mission of completing the ring and subsequently reducing the fortress. Gluzdovsky was a man of solid experience, but without the epic history of the great Soviet marshals of the war. He was competent and methodical. He arrived at Breslau without the glory of Stalingrad or Kursk on his service record, and he left there without having earned it either. The siege of Breslau would not be one of the episodes that Soviet historiography would choose to build myths. But for 82 days he directed operations around a city that refused to die, and he did so with sufficient determination to keep the encirclement intact while the rest of the Soviet army conquered Berlin. On the 9th of February, the units of the 6th Army took Neumarkt and reached the highway leading to Berlin. Upon turning east, they encountered the resistance of the German 8th Panzer Division, which briefly delayed the advance, but could not stop it. On the 11th of February, the 5th Guards Army broke the German defences in the southeast and advanced to the railway line south of the city. On the 13th of February 1945, the vanguards of the 6th Army and the 5th Guards Army linked up about 8 kilometers south of the historical centre. The encirclement was complete. The following day, the Germans managed to open a temporary corridor. It lasted hours before the Soviets sealed it definitively. From the 14th of February 1945, Breslau remained completely isolated. The day the encirclement was closed, the 13th of February, was also the anniversary of the bombing of Dresden the previous year. The coincidence had no military significance, but some of the survivors mentioned it in their later testimonies as if the date carried a weight of its own. The only connection with the outside passed through the air. The Gandow airfield, in the northwest of the city, became immediately the logistical heart of the fortress. The Junkers Ju-52 arrived loaded with ammunition, medicines, concentrated food, mail, replacements. They left with wounded on stretchers and with the last civilians who could still be evacuated. The figures of the airlift are difficult to specify, but testimonies agree that during the weeks of greatest activity, several daily flights operated despite the Soviet anti-aircraft fire that intensified rapidly. At a certain point in February, 2 out of every 5 aircraft that attempted the landing were shot down. The Luftwaffe command warned that at that rate they would be without planes before the winter ended. Subsequent calculations estimate that by air about 600 civilians and several thousand seriously wounded were successfully evacuated. 600 civilians in a city with 230,000 souls trapped. On the 16th of February 1945, the Soviet command sent an ultimatum to the commander of the Festung: unconditional surrender within 24 hours. Major General Hans von Alphen did not respond. Silence was the answer. The following day, the 17th of February, the 6th Army launched its first massive assaults against the south and southeast perimeter. The attack concentrated on the neighborhoods of Schmolz, Opperau, Klettendorf, Herzogshofen, Lamsfeld, and Brockau residential areas with apartment blocks of 4 and 5 floors, interior courtyards, narrow streets, deep basements. the ideal terrain for the Soviet advantage in armor to lose effectiveness and for the fight to turn into something the Germans could sustain longer. The first to absorb the impact of the assault were the men of Regiment Wiel and those of the 609th Infantry Division under the command of Major General Siegfried Ruff. The combat intensified with brutal speed. The Soviet forces broke the outer defenses and captured several nuclei of resistance in a few hours. But when they attempted to advance toward the interior of the city, every building became a new problem. The Soviet assault teams had a tactic they had perfected since Stalingrad: never advance along the street, which turned soldiers into targets. Instead, open holes in the interior walls of the buildings with portable explosive charges or with the cannons of the T-34 and move from room to room, from building to building, within the blocks, without going outside. The German version of the same method, the basement-to-basement tunnels opened during the weeks prior to the siege, served the defense in the same way. Two armies that had learned in the same laboratory of death, Stalingrad, fighting now with the same techniques in a different city. There was furthermore an element of combat that added an additional dimension of horror. The Soviets manufactured and used what they called ground torpedoes, large-caliber metallic tubes filled with explosive, pushed or dragged through the drainage channels and sewers until placed under German positions, where they detonated from below. Against that, conventional defense had few answers. The Germans responded with what their soldiers informally called lime bags, or in the more direct language of the troops, urine bags, cloth sacks filled with quicklime thrown through the windows into the basements occupied by the Soviets. The lime reacted with moisture and produced caustic gases with effects similar to those of tear gas, capable of killing enclosed spaces without ventilation. Subsequent military historians have pointed out that the use of these bags constitutes one of the episodes closest to the operational use of chemical agents in urban combat during the entire Second World War in the European theatre. Simultaneously, in the northeast sector, the Soviet 294th Rifle Division attacked the positions of Regiment Moore, which defended a front of approximately 15 kilometers between Stein and Polanovitz. In the west sector, Regiments Sauer and SS Besslein held on with comparatively less pressure. From Lisse to Hermannsdorf, Regiment Hanf faced the Soviet 359th Rifle Division, and during those combats lost the secondary airfield of Schöngarten. On the 20th of February, the Soviets resumed the bombardment with greater intensity. The field artillery, heavy mortars and Katyusha rocket launchers, which the German soldiers called Stalin organs, because of the sound they produced when firing in salvos, turned the neighborhoods of the south and southeast into a landscape of soot and brick dust. When the fire ceased, the infantry assaults resumed. When the assault stopped, the fire returned. On the 24th of February, Soviet troops advancing among the rubble reached the headquarters of the German 8th Military District and then headed toward the railway tracks crossing Groß-Mochbern and Klein-Mochbern. The soldiers of Regiment Vale attempted to stop them. They were decimated. The reinforcements that arrived to cover those positions fell under artillery fire immediately after occupying their posts. The Germans destroyed numerous Soviet vehicles with the Panzerfaust. The Soviets withdrew the tanks from the front line and replaced them with engineer units specialized in demolishing barricades with portable explosive charges. On the 27th of February, the Soviet assault reached the Kaiser Wilhelm Square. Von Alphen moved his command post toward the northeast and ordered the evacuation of the civilians who still remained in the neighborhoods closest to the front. The defensive perimeter had contracted. Breslau continued without surrendering. Meanwhile, in the neighborhoods the Soviets had taken, the other things that war drags along occurred. Rapes were widespread in the weeks following the taking of the outer suburbs. The Soviet soldiers who arrived after years of war, after having seen what the Germans had done in their own territory, arrived with accounts to settle and with a discipline that exhaustion and alcohol eroded. The officers attempted to control it with varying effectiveness depending on the day. The level of atrocities in Breslau was, according to comparative testimonies, probably lower than in Berlin, but lower is a term that only makes statistical sense, not human. The Germans were not innocent either. Soviet intelligence documents recorded poisoned wells and food with poison left in evacuated houses, booby traps in some buildings, and resistance actions that the Soviets responded to with measures of collective reprisal in the neighborhoods they controlled. There was in those days something similar to a routine, a strange, discontinuous routine, organized around immediate survival. The civilians trapped in the Festung lived mainly in the basements. The apartment blocks had been pierced with openings in the walls between building and building, the same Stalingrad technique so that the inhabitants could move through the blocks without exposing themselves to fire. The basements had their own hierarchies. Those closest to the ground floor served as improvised hospitals, the deepest as permanent shelters. The beds were wooden planks, heating, non-existent in the majority of cases. Electricity arrived intermittently from emergency generators increasingly scarce in fuel. The markets had closed, shops did not exist. But the city had entered the siege with notable reserves. 42,000 half-carcasses of pork, 150,000 rabbits, 5 million eggs, according to the records of the military warehouses at the time of the encirclement. Those reserves fed the garrison and the civilians for weeks, although the distribution was unequal from the beginning and progressively worsened. As the airlift became more precarious, the daily ration per person was reduced. Testimonies from mid-April describe rations that barely sufficed to keep a man standing, not to mention fighting. The post offices of Breslau functioned with relative normality until well into the month of March. It seems absurd put that way. Normal mail within a city encircled and bombed, but the mail was the only link with the outside, with evacuated relatives, with soldiers at the front who had kin in the city. The Junkers Ju-52 of the airlift carried mail sacks in addition to ammunition. The officials continued sorting letters under the same ruins in which the soldiers lived. The last regular mail flight left the Gandow airfield in the first days of April, when the runways were already under direct fire. The military hospitals had moved to the large concrete anti-aircraft bunkers that dotted the city's cylindrical or cube-shaped structures, with walls up to 2 meters thick, capable of resisting the direct impact of heavy artillery. The operating rooms functioned by candlelight or kerosene lamps. The doctors operated for 12, 14, 16 hours straight. A macabre but pragmatic system regulated the organization of the wounded. The most serious, those who died fastest, were located on the lower floors, so that the transfer of the corpse toward the outside was less complicated. The smell of gangrene permeated the floors to the top. The buckets in the corners with amputated limbs waiting to be removed. The doctors who returned to the operating table with hands still stained because there was no time to wash, there was not enough clean water, and the next wounded could not wait. The Festung radio broadcast news bulletins that described victories no one within the city could verify. The Soviet speakers responded from the other side of the lines, in German, inviting to surrender, promising good treatment. Once, the Soviet speakers announced, "Inhabitants of Breslau, the hour of liberation has arrived. 2 armored divisions, already veterans of the East, have broken the encirclement south of the city." Some desperate civilians, with nothing to lose, attempted to head toward the south. They fell under artillery fire. The voice in the speakers knew it from the start. The German speakers also responded in their own way. Wunderwaffe, miracle weapons that would change the course of the war. V-1 and V-2 rockets that would bend the will of the Allies. Armored reserves that would break the encirclement. No one within the fortress believed any more in the miracle weapons by mid-February. But no one could say it out loud either. The usual greeting among the inhabitants of the Festung during those months was not Heil Hitler. It was Bleib übrig, stay standing, survive. That change of a single phrase summarizes it all. The basements also generated their own social dynamics. The long nights and the constant fear produced relationships that in other circumstances would not have occurred. There were what the testimonies of the era called bunker brides, young women who offered company in exchange for food or for protection from some officer. There are cross-references in several testimonies, mentioned always with a mixture of understanding and judgment, that reflects the moral ambiguity of one who judges from outside a situation of extreme survival. In parallel, the clergy continued celebrating Mass in the damaged churches when the buildings allowed, and in the crypts and basements when not. The parishioners who attended those improvised Masses were, according to Pastor Pikert, in many cases people who had not set foot in a church for years. The 3,000 Polish forced labourers within the city lived in conditions incomparably worse. Their barracks had no heating, their rations were smaller, they had no access to the best protected shelters. When the buildings where they slept were destroyed, the available documentation suggests that in several cases they were simply reassigned to another place without anyone doing account of those who had died in the collapse. The surveillance over them decreased as the military situation deteriorated, and toward the end of the siege many moved with relative freedom within the perimeter, although freedom in Jew context meant sharing the same encirclement, the same hunger, and the same artillery fire as the rest. There were also within the civil prison of Breslau approximately 250 people imprisoned during the entire siege. Political prisoners for the most part, men and women detained by the regime for motives ranging from organized sabotage to an imprudent comment in a bar about the situation of the war. The prison continued functioning. The guards remained at their posts. The prisoners remained in their cells while the city burned outside, without knowing if their next threat would be an explosion or an execution. Some were executed during the siege by order of Hanke. The surviving records do not allow for specifying how many. The Linke Hoffmann factory, one of the great facilities producing railway material in Breslau, continued functioning within the fortress during the first months of the siege. Its workers, combining the material available in the workshops with the urgent initiative of one who knows that what they produce today can mark the difference tomorrow, built an armoured train during the siege. It was not a plan designed months before. They built it while the city burned around them. The result was a formidable combat vehicle within its context. 4 88mm anti-aircraft cannons, the same ones the Wehrmacht had used since North Africa to destroy Allied tanks, adapted for horizontal fire. Several 37mm cannons and numerous 20mm automatic cannons. A crew of approximately 100 men. The train operated on a circuit along the tracks in the southeast of the city, appearing suddenly from behind buildings to fire on Soviet positions and withdrawing before the enemy artillery could locate and respond to it. Its appearances were unpredictable in time and place, which multiplied its psychological effect on the attackers beyond its concrete material damage. Its tactical effectiveness was real, but the price was high. 1 out of every 3 men who crewed it fell as a casualty during the months of combat, a loss rate higher than that of most of the garrison units. The Goliath vehicle's 50 units arrived in January had a more irregular record. They were miniature remote-controlled tanks, barely a meter in height, filled with explosive, guided by cable to the position intended for destruction. Technically interesting, tactically capricious. The cable became tangled. The steering mechanisms failed under the mud and rubble, and their speed was so low that the Soviet soldiers learned quickly to neutralize them by cutting the cable before they arrived. There was, however, at least one documented operation in which 3 Goliaths were directed through the channels of the Oder River toward a bridge supporting Soviet troop movement. All 3 reached the objective and the bridge was destroyed. The troops trapped on the opposite bank were ambushed. Along with the armoured train and the Goliaths, the ingenuity of despair produced other solutions. The engineers of the garrison adapted the large buildings of the peripheries of the historical centre to turn them into firing positions with prefixed fields of fire. Every window looking toward the south or southeast was catalogued as a potential position numbered on the command maps with firing angles established beforehand. When the defenders withdrew from a block under Soviet pressure, they generally did so by exploding or setting fire to the positions they abandoned so that the conquered building became an obstacle rather than a point of support for the attacker. The Soviet artillery encircling Breslau was enormous in volume, but faced the problem that all heavy artillery encounters in urban combat. When the lines are 20 meters apart, firing on the enemy frequently implies firing also on one's own. The Soviets learned, as in Stalingrad, that engineer assault units with portable explosive charges, flamethrowers and hand grenades were more effective at the scale of a building than the T-34 tanks, which became trapped in the narrow streets and turned into static targets for the German Panzerfausts. According to an account from a Soviet soldier of the 359th Rifle Division cited in later investigations, the tactic of advance within the blocks, not along the street but through the walls, took longer to generate ground gained but took much less time to generate own casualties. By the first days of March 1945, the defensive perimeter of Festung Breslau had contracted but remained substantial. The Germans defended a line that ran approximately from Ottwitz to the vicinity of Grebschen. The front had stabilized in a way that neither of the two sides expected. Colonel General Ferdinand Schörner, commander of Army Group Center, had reached the conclusion that von Alphen was not the right man for the fortress. Schörner was known within the German army as one of the most implacable commanders with his subordinates. His readiness to shoot officers for what he considered a lack of determination was sufficiently known so that his name generated fear even among the generals who served under his orders. He argued that the defense of Breslau needed a more aggressive command. Von Alphen, in his memoirs written after the war, would claim that his dismissal was due mainly to conflicts with Hanke, with whom tensions had been permanent. Probably both reasons were true and reinforced each other. On the 6th of March 1945, a plane landed in Breslau with Hermann Niehoff on board. He was 51 years old and was an infantry officer competent without special brilliance in any sense, neither brilliant nor disastrous. He assumed official command on the 8th of March. He inherited a situation that had no tactical solution. He knew it. His options were to resist as long as possible or to capitulate. Hanke would have him shot if he capitulated, so he resisted. By the 8th of March, the defensive line ran from Ottwitz to Grebschen, about 4 kilometers south of the historical center. Between that line and the market square there were apartment neighborhoods, churches, parks, hospitals, and more than 100,000 civilians living in basements. Between the 19th and the 25th of March, the Soviet 22nd and 74th Corps launched a series of penetration attacks in depth. The objective was to break the perimeter in one go and reach the historical center. The Germans prevented it, but the cost was high. In those days, the armored train deployed its greatest activity, and the paratrooper units of Captains Trotz and Skau were employed as a rapid reaction force at the most compromised points. The German 4th Panzer Army attempted to break the encirclement from the west during this period, attacking to re-establish the railway line toward Breslau. The Soviet reaction was immediate. The operation failed before reaching any result. By mid-March, the garrison depended almost exclusively on air transport for everything: ammunition, medicines, food, letters. The rate of loss of transport aircraft continued to increase. Niehoff ordered the strengthening and expansion of the defenses around the Gandow airfield. The area was covered by a dense network of trenches, wire entanglements, and machine gun positions. Those positions, built quickly with what was available, were occupied by Kampfgruppe Tilgner, along with paratroopers from the Trotz and Skau groups, plus several battalions of the Volkssturm. On the 31st of March, local combats in the vicinity of Gandow left the neighborhoods of Mariahöfchen and Schmiedefeld in Soviet hands. The landing strip remained in German power, but by the margins. That same month, on the 20th of April, General Niehoff distributed chocolates among his troops in honor of the 56th birthday of Adolf Hitler. It was a gesture of internal propaganda, a sign that normalcy still existed, that the Reich continued, that the Führer's birthday deserved to be celebrated even within a city that had been systematically destroyed for 2 months. Hitler would be 10 days dead by the time Breslau surrendered. The Gandow airfield was, from the start of the siege, the most critical point of the entire defense. Without Gandow, the fortress died of starvation. Each Junkers Ju 52 that landed brought ammunition, medicines, replacements. Each one that took off carried wounded. The civil airfield of Gandow, built before the war in the northwest extremity of the city for regular passenger flights, transformed into the vital artery of 50,000 soldiers and 230,000 civilians. General Gluzdowski knew it. Toward the end of March and first days of April, he shifted the axis of his military effort toward the western sector, with the primary objective of capturing Gandow and cutting the airlift. Niehoff knew it too. In response, he took the decision that subsequent historians have qualified as the most costly and, in the end, most useless of the entire siege. To build an alternative airfield in the Kaiserstrasse area, in the north of the historical center, it was necessary to demolish an entire avenue of residential blocks of several floors. Churches, schools, warehouses, tenement houses over a length of approximately 2 kilometers. 60,000 people worked on the project between German civilians summoned by decree and Polish forced laborers without any possibility of refusal. The construction was carried out under constant Soviet artillery fire because the Soviets understood immediately what was being built and tried to prevent it. Subsequent estimates place at about 3,000 of the people who died during the construction, crushed by bombings or by the collapse of the buildings being demolished. The runway was finished, and it was barely used. By the time it was operational, the aircraft available for the airlift were so scarce that only cargo gliders with a capacity much lower than the Ju-52 arrived, 3,000 dead to build a runway that barely functioned. On the 1st of April, 1945, Easter Sunday, 750 Soviet bombers flew over Breslau from dawn until dusk. It was the largest bombardment the city had suffered until then. The Gothic Cathedral of St. John burned. The churches on Cathedral Island and Sand Island were destroyed. Hanke's headquarters in ruins. The central post office, the savings bank building, the SS facilities, everything burned. In the residential sector of the southeast, 80% of the buildings remaining standing suffered new damage or were completely collapsed. The city's fire brigade, which had continued operating during the entire siege, lost 35% of its active personnel that day. But that same day, something else occurred. While the bombers did their work over the historical center, in the western sector, the Soviet 74th Corps launched the definitive assault on Gandow. The 359th and 112th Divisions advanced with speed, overcame the outer defenses and encircled numerous pockets of resistance inside the surrounding buildings. On the morning of the 1st of April, the Gandow airfield fell into Soviet hands. The airlift now depended solely on parachute drops. The assault of the 74th Corps destroyed a large part of the German forces in the western sector. The defenders were forced to retreat about 3 kilometers in a few hours. From that day on, the supply of the fortress came to depend on what could fall by parachute within the reduced perimeter in the darkness under anti-aircraft fire. It was an equation that the logisticians could calculate with precision. The garrison consumed more than it received from the moment Gandow fell. The Battle of Berlin began on the 16th of April, 1945. With it, Breslau ceased to be a strategic priority for the Soviet command. Gluzdowski's Sixth Army adopted a defensive posture during the final weeks of April. Its divisions were exhausted. Konev's directive was clear. Contain Breslau, do not assume more unnecessary losses to take it. Berlin was the war. Breslau was a geographical appendix with 230,000 civilians and 50,000 soldiers inside who, for strategic purposes, no longer mattered. What replaced the full-scale attacks was the war of systematic attrition, continuous artillery bombardments, propaganda operations with loudspeakers and the dropping of leaflets, local actions by engineers who every night attempted to destroy a bridge or mine a barricade, snipers who methodically worked the known transit points. Almost daily, thousands of leaflets fell on the city, informing the German garrison of the real situation of the war. The fall of Königsberg on the 9th of April. The Allied advance toward the Elbe from the west. The situation of Berlin. Leaflets signed at times by captured German generals who described the conditions of Soviet captivity and encouraged their former comrades to surrender. The Germans responded with their own leaflets, with their own radio broadcasts, with a propaganda that no one within the perimeter believed anymore, but that everyone pretended to believe because the alternative of saying out loud that they did not believe it led to the firing squad. Within the perimeter, the combats continued during all of April with local attacks that the defenders responded to with the same external energy as at the beginning of the siege, although with fewer men available and less ammunition per man. In mid-April, the last reinforcements of any significance arrived. Regiment SS Breslau was moved from other sectors of the encirclement, along with elements of the 609th Division. Hanke ordered that every man capable of carrying a weapon be sent to the front line, but every man capable of carrying a weapon in Breslau in mid-April already included 15-year-old adolescents and 65-year-old veterans of the First World War, who in other circumstances would have been considered unfit for active service. On the 25th of April, the perimeter of the Festung had reduced substantially. The Soviets had advanced to less than 2 kilometers from the historical center in several sectors. The ring, the Great Market Square, was within the range of Soviet field artillery. On some nights, the citizens sleeping in the basements of the historical center could hear the sound of explosions not as distant thunder, but as direct blows on the ground that were felt physically through the walls. On the 29th of April, 1945, Adolf Hitler signed his political testament in the bunker under the Reich Chancellery. In it, he named Karl Hanke Reichsführer SS, the highest rank of the SS, successor to Himmler, who had attempted to negotiate on his own with the Western Allies and had fallen into disgrace. It was a designation on paper, in the midst of total collapse, that granted Hanke the highest rank of the SS apparatus in the final hours of a regime that had numbered hours. Hanke received the news in Breslau on the 5th of May. He had spent weeks inside the fortress, supervising executions, sending patriotic messages to the garrison, being photographed with the Volkssturm for the last broadcasts of the Festung radio. 2 days after receiving his appointment as Reichsführer SS, Hanke abandoned the city. On the 4th of May 1945, Soviet Berlin had already been under the red flag for 4 days. In Breslau, the Soviet speakers broadcast from dawn a message in German: the war was finished, the conditions of surrender were favorable, the lives of the soldiers and the correct treatment of prisoners were guaranteed. That same morning, a delegation formed by 4 representatives of the churches of Breslau presented itself at the headquarters of the Festung: Pastor Ernst Hornig, Dr. Konrad, Bishop Joseph Ferche, and Canon Joseph Kramer. They were the men who had been celebrating Mass in half-destroyed churches, burying their parishioners in the parks, listening to the confessions of soldiers who knew they were going to die, writing in their diaries the things they could not say out loud. They were the only ones within the Festung who had maintained a perspective that did not depend on Hanke's orders nor on the slogans of the party. Their demand was clear. Resistance no longer had military or moral sense. The city was destroyed. The war was lost. Every additional hour of combat was a death without any achievable objective. General Niehoff listened to them. He dismissed them without a definitive answer. In the afternoon of the same day, Pastor Hornig repeated the same demand directly before the commanders of the troops. Hanke learned of these maneuvers and summoned Niehoff. The conversation was tense. Hanke ordered that all contact with the clergy be cut. He threatened to arrest Niehoff. Niehoff, according to the accounts reconstructed later by several witnesses, held the gaze. And at that moment, perhaps in that specific moment, in that room, Hanke understood that the fortress had ended for him. During the night of the 5th to the 6th of May, Karl Hanke reached the Kaiserstrasse strip. In an improvised hangar, a Fiesler Stork awaited him, the small reconnaissance plane that had been kept for use by the commander of the fortress in emergency situations. Hanke demanded that the pilot take him. The pilot obeyed. Hours later, the Breslau garrison received a brief message. The new Reichsführer SS had reached his destination. There was no prior notice. There was no explanation. There was no farewell. The man who for months had signed death sentences for cowardice before the enemy, who had ordered a deputy mayor to be dragged through the streets in a truck before being shot, who had proclaimed that he who fears an honourable death dies in dishonour, had left in the only available plane without telling anyone he was going. The final destination of Karl Hanke is subject to debate. The most probable version, documented partially in historical investigations and collected in Wikipedia in Spanish with a specific date, is that he was captured in occupied Czechoslovakia in Neudorf, in the Sudetenland, and died on the 8th of June 1945 at the hands of Czech partisans or guards who recognized him when he attempted to escape from a prisoner transport. His wife requested the official declaration of death in the 50s. No one found a body that could be identified with certainty. With Hanke out, the last psychological barrier disappeared. In the morning of the 6th of May 1945, the Festung headquarters responded for the first time to the Soviet demands. The General Staff of the garrison sent Captain von Bruck and Colonel Tiesler, Deputy Chief of the General Staff, to cross the lines with a white flag. They were awaited by Major Omar Yakayev and Colonel V. Chichin of the Soviet 22nd Corps at the intersection of Strasse der SA and Victoria Strasse. The meeting was brief. Both parties agreed that Niehoff would present himself in person to sign the capitulation. That afternoon, General Hermann Niehoff crossed the front accompanied by his general staff. He was conducted to the Villa Colonia, headquarters of the Soviet 22nd Corps, at number 14 Kaiser Friedrichstrasse in the southern suburbs, an area that had fallen into Soviet hands weeks before, when the combat had not yet devastated that sector, and which had been preserved relatively intact. The villa was a pre-war bourgeois residence with a garden with furniture that remained in its place, with windows that still had glass. An implausible scenario after 82 days inside the Festung. The later accounts of the German officers who accompanied Niehoff agree that the meeting was surprisingly civil. The Soviets served vodka and something to eat. There was a moment that several witnesses describe as almost festive, with the relief of both sides that it was ending. Niehoff believed he had negotiated favourable conditions for his troops, guarantees regarding the treatment of prisoners, respect for the wounded. The terms were accepted by General Gluzdowski. The terms were subsequently ignored by the Soviet authorities above Gluzdowski. That was not Gluzdowski's responsibility. It was the habitual mechanics of surrender on the Eastern Front. At 18:20 hours on the 6th of May 1945, Hermann Niehoff signed the capitulation of his troops. At 21:00 hours, the first Soviet units entered the historical center of Breslau. The siege had lasted 82 days. Breslau was the last large city of the Reich to surrender 4 days after the fall of Berlin, 2 days before the signing of the unconditional capitulation of Germany in Reims. Niehoff was taken to the USSR as a prisoner of war. He was released in 1955. Von Alphen was also a prisoner for years. Both wrote memoirs later. Both described the siege from perspectives that inevitably minimized their own responsibilities and maximized those of the party. The reality, as always, was more complicated than any individual version. Breslau had before the siege a little more than 30,000 buildings. More than 21,000 were destroyed or unusable, nearly 70% of the total built stock. The neighborhoods of the south and southeast, which had borne the primary attack since February, were a field of ruins where the street patterns could only be followed on pre-war maps because on the ground, the boundaries between one street and another had disappeared under tons of rubble. German military casualties during the siege are estimated, depending on the source, between 5,700 and 13,000 dead. The figure of 23,000 wounded appears in multiple sources with greater consistency. The rest of the garrison was made prisoner, between 45,000 of whom a substantial part were wounded and several thousand passed away in Soviet camps during the months following the surrender. Soviet casualties are difficult to establish with definitive precision. The documents that were declassified after the Cold War point to figures ranging between 31,000 and more than 60,000 total casualties, dead and wounded, during the 82 days of the siege. For an operation that the Soviet command considered secondary, the cost was extraordinarily high. Gluzdowski's 6th Army had arrived at Breslau with 6 rifle divisions. It lost more than half of them through accumulated casualties. Civilian casualties are the most difficult figure to specify. Estimates vary significantly according to the source and the methodology employed. Some studies speak of 30,000 dead among the civilian population during the siege, properly speaking. Others, relying on partially preserved church records and on reports from post-combat cleaning teams, place the figure at up to 80,000 civilians dead within the perimeter during the 82 days. If to that are added the dead during the January evacuation, with the estimate of 18,000 only in the stretch toward Kanth, and a total estimated up to 100,000 during the entire evacuation of the city, the civilian human cost of the period, January to May 1945 in Breslau, is measured in hundreds of thousands of lives. They were people who, in December 1944, lived in an intact city. People who, in their immense majority, had not taken any warlike decision and who were forced to pay the price of those taken by others. A report prepared in the summer of 1945 by officials of the Saxon administration established the percentages of responsibility in the destruction. 33% of the total damage was caused by Soviet artillery bombardments. Another 33% by fires, including those of the second fire of May, and the remaining 34% was caused by the German defenders themselves, the demolitions to create fields of fire, the construction of the Kaiserstrasse strip, the barricades raised with materials from surrounding buildings, the buildings deliberately burned when retreating to deprive the enemy of positions. The Festung Breslau destroyed Breslau. That is the equation that the report establishes with a bureaucratic coldness more eloquent than any explicit judgment. The great documentary archive of the siege is the work of a man whose name general history has ignored, but who in research circles on the subject is simply irreplaceable. He was a member of the Hitler Youth during the siege, worked as a messenger within the perimeter, and survived. After the war, he built a completely different life. He became a botanist, worked in plant research, taught at a university. But in the mid-1980s, already being elderly, he began to systematically compile everything he found regarding the battle. Diaries, letters, photographs, testimonies of survivors, military maps from both sides, newspaper articles, war reports. The archive he built over 20 years occupies 12,000 pages, distributed in 14 volumes, and contains 14,000 documents. For any researcher wanting to understand what occurred in each neighborhood of Breslau on each date of the siege, that archive is essential. A complete set can reach a cost between £300 and £1,000 sterling on the second-hand market. It weighs considerably. The priest Paul Peikert was, in January 1945, parish priest of the St. Mauritius parish in Breslau since 1932. He was 60 years old when the encirclement closed. His notebooks of annotations, written in pencil and kept in the church basements, are the most complete testimony from within the civilian perspective. They are not documents of strategic analysis. They are the description of a man who every morning between 6:30 and 8 went out to bury whoever had died during the night, because that was the only hour in which the cannons were silent. They are the description of how his parish was disappearing name by name, week after week, until at the end of the siege, those remaining were the survivors of a community that had been decimated. Peikert died in 1949, 4 years after the siege. His memoirs were published in Polish under the title Festung Breslau in Den Berichten eines Pfarrers, and became one of the fundamental primary sources of historiography on the siege. The Soviet war journalist Vasily Molinin was the principal correspondent of the Sixth Army during the siege. His diary, from which Richard Hargreaves extracted extensively in his book Breslau 1945, Hitler's Last Fortress, provides a perspective that German documents cannot offer. How the Soviets saw the resistance, how the tenacity of the defenders was described among the Red Army soldiers, what the conditions of the attacking troops were in the winter of 1945. His annotations are, at various moments, more honest regarding the failures and sufferings of his own side than official accounts. The Soviet archives on the siege, for decades inaccessible, began to be declassified and translated into Polish in the last 2 decades, a process that researchers working on the subject continue to utilize. Roger Morehouse and Norman Davies dedicated a central place to Breslau in their work Microcosm, an analysis of the history of the city over centuries as a case study of the political and identity transformations of Central Europe. The description of the siege in its initial pages was, according to Hargreaves himself in public interviews, one of the triggers for his own work on the subject. The city that the Soviet soldiers walked through on the night of the 6th of May 1945 was barely recognizable to anyone who had known it in 1939. The historical heart had survived in better relative state than the southern neighborhoods, but it was damaged, stained with soot, emptied of its inhabitants. The statues remained standing in Der Ring, the great market square. The facades of the principal buildings remained standing, although marked by shrapnel and bullet holes. In the southern suburbs, which had been the principal theatre of combat since February, the apartment blocks that in January formed lively residential neighborhoods were now loose walls over mounds of rubble with empty window frames looking toward a sky that no longer had smoke. On the 11th of May, 5 days after the surrender, occurred what historians call the Second Fire of Breslau. Soviet troops accessed the wine and beer warehouses that had survived the siege. What followed was a fire that extended for days, fed by spilled alcohol and by a city that was essentially fuel. Exposed wood, broken roof beams, wooden rubble that the siege had left piled everywhere. According to the estimates of historians who compared the damage maps of May and those of June, that second fire caused more damage to the stock of buildings that had survived the siege than all the months of combined bombings. The flames burned for weeks, fed without anyone systematically extinguishing them until they simply ran out of material. The first Poles arrived in the city in the days immediately following the surrender. They came mainly from Lwów and from other cities of eastern Poland that the Yalta and Potsdam agreements had placed within the new borders of the Soviet Union. Poland, in terms of the map, shifted toward the west. It lost territories in the east and gained the German territories up to the Oder-Neisse. Breslau became Wrocław. The expulsion of the Germans remaining in the city, the process known in German as Vertreibung, was executed with a celerity that the testimonies of the expelled described as brutal. The methodology was direct: a knock on the door at 6 in the morning, an hour to collect the essentials, out of the house before 7. The trains took them to the west, to a devastated Germany where there was no work, no houses available, nor anyone waiting for them with any plan. Furniture, photographs, work tools, libraries were left behind. Everything that did not fit in a backpack or in a small suitcase remained in the rooms that the Poles would occupy in a matter of hours. At the end of 1945, there were still 300,000 Germans in the city. In January 1948, the Polish authorities officially declared that Breslau was free of German population. 3,000 still remained, retained for tasks for which there were not enough qualified Polish workers. The reconstruction was slow and asymmetrical. The bricks recovered from the rubble of Breslau, millions of units, piled in endless rows, were not used to rebuild Wrocław. They were loaded into trains and sent to Warsaw, which also needed to be rebuilt from scratch after its own systematic destruction in 1944. The city that received the bricks was the capital. The city that yielded them would take decades to recover. Until the mid-50s, extensive areas of what had been residential southern Breslau remained empty lots or mounds of uncleared rubble. The Soviet-style block buildings built later to replace the destroyed neighborhoods still mark that strip of the city today, with an architecture that does not hide its era. What was indeed reconstructed, with a dedication that Polish historiography has widely recognized, was the historical center. Der Ring, the market square, was restored stone by stone until recovering the physiognomy of previous centuries. The buildings that had lost their upper floors in the bombings were rebuilt. The cathedral again had its towers. The bell towers that had been truncated by the bombings were reconstructed decades later, some already in the post-communist period. In 1948, the Polish communist authorities organized in Wrocław the exhibition of recovered territories. which attracted more than 1.5 million visitors in 3 months and aimed to celebrate the incorporation of the Western territories into Poland. It was propaganda, but it was also, in its practical dimension, a statement of intent regarding the future of the city. In the 70s and 80s, Wrocław became one of the centers of the opposition movement to the communist regime in Poland. The city that had been German for centuries, that had been razed, that had been repopulated by Poles displaced from their own homes, generated in its adopted sons a new identity, a loyalty built not on heritage but on shared experience. The young Poles who grew up in Wrocław in the 60s and 70s had not been born there. Their parents had not either. But the city belonged to them in the only way in which cities end up belonging to someone, because they had decided to stay. Whoever visits Wrocław today finds a university city, dynamic, with one of the youngest populations in Poland. The trams circulate again through streets that in 1945 were blocked by the overturned trams of the garrison. The market square reconstructed is one of the most beautiful urban spaces in Central Europe, with cafes in the arcades and tourists photographing the coloured Gothic buildings. Underneath the Szczytniki Park, where in the post-war period bodies were buried in areas that did not reach the cemeteries, there are tree roots that grow among layers that archaeologists have no incentives to excavate. The bunker under the old building of the Luisenkirche, where von Alphen and Niehoff directed the battle in its final weeks before transferring command, has been partially restored. The last time it was documented by external visitors, a part of its galleries served as a Soviet-themed nightclub. History has its own forms of irony. The old Gandow airfield, for which thousands of people fought and died in the first week of April 1945, is today a green area and an exhibition park to the northwest of the city. Over what was the Kaiserstrasse runway built with the rubble of demolished buildings and with 3,000 dead buried symbolically in the foundations of its history, extend today the avenues of modern Wrocław. Breslau was the last large city of the Reich to surrender. It resisted when Vienna had already fallen. It resisted when Berlin was agonizing in its final hours. It resisted 2 days longer than the end of the war in Europe. That fact, that resistance until the last second, was not an act of spontaneous collective bravery. It was the result of a system that executed its own civilians for waving a white flag, that abandoned 700,000 people in the January cold without transport or provisions, that built a landing strip with forced labor under enemy bombardment so that the man who ordered its construction could use it to escape in the only available plane. The siege of Breslau figures in the list of the most intense urban combat episodes of the Second World War, along with Stalingrad, Budapest, Manila, and Berlin. With one difference, in none of the other cases was the resistance of the city sustained by a single man whose primary motivation appeared to be, in many moments, the fear of being himself executed if he did not hold the line he had promised to hold. Hanke was afraid of Hitler. The soldiers were afraid of Hanke. The civilians were afraid of the soldiers, and all were also afraid of the Soviets. Fear, taken to a sufficient scale and sustained long enough, can make a city resist for 82 days. What it cannot do is build anything lasting when it ends. On the 7th of May, 1945, when the world began to process the general capitulation of Germany, the walls of Breslau still smelled of smoke. 2 days before, it was still the last fortress of the Reich,